This is the Simply Love Jesus podcast, where we explore life and faith through the lens of one question, which is, what does it mean to simply love Jesus? My name is Griffin, and this is part 3 of our series on leadership. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, we would love if you did so you can be part of the full conversation. Enjoy the episode.
So good leaders are available for you. Good leaders equip you, and good leaders inspire you to be your best. So those are some examples of good leadership. And those are qualities, and we can see them as good because of the results that they produce in their people. It's not self-centered. In fact, it's others focused.
Yeah, I like that. Mm-hmm. Caleb, what about you? Who's a leader in your life?
I would say an example of a leader in my life would probably go back to like my youth pastor in high school. Like he not only equipped me, but he did life with me. Like, he was always there. And he has this ability to he had this ability to make you feel like you could take over the world. You know, he made you feel like you were just gonna like get up, you're gonna go take on the world, and we were gonna, do this thing. Like, he instilled like a lot of confidence in whatever we were doing. He kind of very much was that very just battle charge into the battleground kind of leader. And so that's what I remember about him. That's how I remember being felt led. Well, I remember just being with him, feeling like, oh man, we're gonna like change the world. And so it's he instilled purpose in me is how I would summarize that.
That's good. I'd say one more thing that makes me think of a leader is like they gotta be willing to like humble themselves almost, like in 2 areas. Like one, like when you mess up, like when you're leading a group of people and you do something wrong or something, like you handle something wrongly, you gotta be able to admit like they were wrong in that scenario. Like you gotta be able to admit that to the people that you're leading. Another one I'd say is like you also just got to be willing to like meet someone kind of where they're at. Like if you're talking to someone who's like Caleb, I'd say you do a good job of this, because like when we talked about Bible, or like if I have a question biblically or something that I'm not sure about, like I can go to you and I know that you're not going to like give me some like, oh, you're stupid for asking that, like I know way more than you, but like you'll kind of like come where I'm at and like give me an example that like I can understand, So like I'd say like a good leader does that, where they're willing to like just like meet you where you're at and just come down to your level almost, and just not like thinking themselves as higher than you, but really just like be willing to help you out and like answer your questions and stuff.
Part of being a leader is of a good leader is that you have to keep your ego in check, because yes, you are the leader of people, but you also have to be humble and understand that the actions of the group and the actions of the people that you're following, you have to be able to take ownership of that, So if your group fails, you got to be able to take ownership on you, or you got to be able to take ownership for that because they're under your leadership.
Yeah. Well, it even goes into another question, which is like, what does the Bible have to say about leadership? So, you talked about humility, and you talk about having your ego in check. It's fascinating. Before Jesus walked the earth, did you know that humility was not seen as a positive thing? Like, we would say it's good to be humble, but before Jesus walked the earth, that wasn't the case. People would see.
I think one might be able to argue that it's not even a desirable thing to have today.
Oh, it's not. But even more so, like, we would still say it's an honorable thing. But in the worldview of the early world, like the first century world, their worldview, humility was not even an honorable thing or a desirable thing. It was a frowned upon thing. It was something that was seen as negative. Back then, it was very much about, I'm going to do what it takes to reach for glory and my personal honor and glory. I'm going to elevate myself to get higher and higher, and it's all about your ego and pride. Pride was seen as the dominant, honorable quality. Like, wow, he's very proud. Like, he's a very like pride, like very. It was a very Caesar-like quality, if that makes sense. And after Christ, that the scriptures, the Bible, Christians were the very first. It wasn't until after Jesus had risen again that literature had started to document humility as a honorable thing. It's one example of showing how Christians have always been or just those who follow God have been the example for things that we should strive for, including the areas of leadership and what a good leader does. You look at Philippians chapter 2, and it talks about how we should have the same mindset of Jesus, who, and it says in verse 6, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. The NLT translation says that he gave up his divine privileges, and I very much like that terminology. They gave up his divine privileges. He was God, but yet even though he is God, he did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage. And yet because of that, he became the least of these, and yet because of that, God exalts him to the highest place and gave him the name above every name. And so it's this very flipped upside down idea of leadership, is that the Bible often takes our worldview of the things we think is right and it flips it upside down. Yes, the other day, the news was on and Trump was giving like this speech, and he talked about how what did he say? If I find it, I'll tweet it to you. But basically, like in his speech, he was talking about how the way other countries talk about us and they want to prod at us or whatever. And he says, well, the right thing to do is if they prod at us, we got to prod back because that'll just make us look weak. And so it was very much like the way he was talking was very much you got to repay the evil for evil kind of thing. You can't, if they're going to talk smack, well, you got to talk smack back. If they're going to do this, you got to give it right back to them, or else you're going to be seen as weak. Fire. Yeah, exactly. It's very much a fire by fire mentality. And it was so fascinating because that's so backwards to what the Bible commands us to do. Yeah. The Bible commands us to turn the other cheek. And Trump in his speech basically would have said, if they slap you on the cheek, we're slapping right back. And yet that's what happens when we allow our selfish nature to drive us to what leadership should look like, rather than letting the standard that God puts in front of us to be the example of leadership. And Jesus modeled that for us when he laid his life down for us. He became the least of these. And that was the greatest place you could be as a leader, is the one who is unseen, the one who is at the lowest of the low, the one who is last. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first in the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of agree. Like earlier when you were talking about, like Griffin said this too, where like we were talking about how humility was like not a thing in the Bible till Jesus and stuff. And I was gonna say, like, even today, like, it's not a thing. Like, if you go on social media and stuff, like, you'll see so many things that are just like not demonstrating at all, where like you have like people like tweeting and posting like girls and stuff saying like, oh, like, don't talk to this person if they're not in like your league and stuff, like they don't deserve to talk to you, don't like talk to them at all. Or people like, yeah, don't talk to me unless you're like as good as me as this sport or whatever. And just like all this like stuff you see, or people are just totally like prideful and just posting about it all the time and stuff. And it's just, you don't really see humility anymore at all. And when you go like social media and just like stuff on nowadays, I feel like it's almost gotten like more and more like we become more and more of like a proud society than like humble at all, is what I would say.
Yeah. Well, what are some other examples that you know of in the Bible of leadership?
I would say Moses and Aaron.
Yeah, that's true. I'd agree with that one too.
How so?
Well, they weren't like really equipped to lead. Like Aaron was one that, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure Aaron was one with like speech problems or whatever, and Moses was just like or one of them was afraid to talk to people, and one of them had like an actual like hindrance and stuff, and like they didn't want to at first, and they kind of refused to, but then like once God like obviously showed him his power with like the rock and the snake or whatever, with like the rod, and like once God showed them his power, like they were willing to like actually lead and stuff to people.
See, it's so interesting. Tell me a specific example that you know of where Moses was actually an example of a good leader.
Well, yeah, it's like he wasn't like on his own, but through God he was able to be one, which is what I would say. It's like all of us.
Mm.
None of us naturally are going to be good, but like
Because
with
I
help.
Well, Caleb, I would say probably when they're on the way to the promised land.
really.
Actually, I don't know.
Because
Oh,
think about it.
gosh.
I if you go back and actually read Exodus and Numbers and stuff like that, you see a lot more examples of how Moses was a sucky leader than you do about him being a good leader.
Actually, I agree with you now because now that I think about it, the only thing that the Israelites were was complacent and not on the same page as Moses.
Yeah, they were, and Moses was always complaining about the people. And in fact, when he struck the rock, it was out of anger. And then God, because of that, God said, "Hey, you can't go to the promised land."
Yeah, that's true. That is
like
true.
he struck the rock and created water out of it, out of frustration. And in fact, he didn't even go and free the Israelites on his own accord. He did it reluctantly, and he tried to find every single excuse in the book to not go and do it.
To be fair though, would you want to go to the pharaoh of like the powerful nation and tell him that, knowing you might be murdered?
Oh, I mean, I probably wouldn't, but you imagine like he's still the example of, he's still like, we look at him as a good example of leadership, and there's a lot more times where he was
Yeah.
a good example of what not to do as a leader.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, because you see all these movies and stuff and these stories glorifying Moses and what he did with the Red Sea and stuff.
Yeah.
But you don't really get down to the nitty gritty details and realize
He didn't
that
do anything with the
wasn't
Red
that
Sea
good
though.
of a
God
leader.
did. That, like we're like he parts it. So
Yeah,
that's
but
true,
even
that's true.
I agree with Caleb.
yeah, well, even think about this is like there are plenty of other examples that we don't think of, like, you know, not to toot my own horn, but Joshua and Caleb. But when they were going to check out the promised land and everyone else was like, dude, they're giants, they're too big, and Joshua and Caleb were like, we got God on our side, we got this.
Same personality as you today.
There are other examples of what a good leader does, and ones that we don't think of. I think of, honestly, when I think of qualities of a good leader, I think of like 1 Corinthians, where it says like love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast. You look at all these things and I'm like, man, that's a good quality for a leader. It's, you know, you look at like, you know, I want a leader who's patient with me, who's kind. I want a leader who is not going to hold grudges against me. Because, you know, you ever seen a leader who holds a grudge against you and then they start overscheduling you because they don't like you? It's like, or they start giving you all these dumb tasks because they're just doing it out of spite. I don't want a leader who does that. There's, you look at other examples, the fruits of the Spirit, you know, it's good, faithfulness, goodness, self-control, gentleness. These are all qualities of leaders. And really, I would say the best example of a leader is Jesus himself, who in his greatest moment of leadership, other than sacrificing himself, after than being, you know, murdered and put on the cross and dying on our behalf, dying for those who hated you. You know, Romans 5:8 says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. But even more so, while he was still in the middle of his ministry, one of his best examples of leadership was when he washed his disciples' feet. You know, the foot washing was for the lowest servant in the house. That was like the lowest of the low kind of position, and yet he was stooped down to do that. And so it just goes an example as the last will be first and the first shall be last. And that is the very same mentality that every person who desires to be a leader should have.
Yeah, that's good.
Got to be humble.
Another humble leader, I'd say, like two of the my favorite leaders in the whole Bible. I'd say like the best leader by example would be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, just because they're willing to to go through fire literally without whining, without complaining, without like even like dare saying like, God, even like help me. You know, like obviously they're probably praying, but like just being willing to do that. Like I don't know how many people would actually not give up their faith in that situation.
Yeah.
And then another one I'd say is John the Baptist, and that would be like not even lead by example, but kind of is, because like he had all the followers, like he was an actual leader, like everyone thought like this dude was like legit and stuff, which he was, but like when Jesus comes, like you see like he says like he must increase and I must decrease, you know, so like he was absolutely willing to like humble himself and be like, I'm not the real like leader here, Jesus is, you know, like
Well, and it's even more amazing because John the Baptist was a very well-known person at the time. He gathered a massive following of people because he was baptizing people. Everyone knew who he was. He gained a massive following where he had a lot of disciples. A lot, remember Jesus had more than just the 12 apostles as his disciples. He had, I can't remember at one point, it was he had like 72 disciples. I can't remember how many. He had a lot of disciples. But John had even more disciples, and yet all of his disciples started to leave and go follow Jesus. And when that happened, John was like, that's okay. Like, the whole purpose is that everyone would stop following me and instead they would start following Jesus.
I think another example of leadership is Jesus himself when he's on the cross and he's looking at his mother. This is in John 19:26 and 27 when it says, when Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And then I love this part. From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. And I love how, like, even though he couldn't be with his disciples, he still had that path. He still had that path laid down for him. He gave them instructions and showed them what he wanted. And he laid his expectations clear for his disciple, and I love that.
Obviously, you could list Paul for one, because just that he was willing to continue to lead his ministry, through all the churches. Like, he was always like kind of Jacob was saying earlier, being available, like Jacob VP was for him. Paul was like that to all the churches. Like, he was constantly available, sending them letters even when he couldn't be there, checking in on them and stuff. And even like when he was like thrown in jail, he continued to be a leader, just like setting an example for other people that, like, because if you think about that story, like when the jail broke open, all the people stayed. That's how much they really like followed Paul, that they were willing to stay in jail when they could have easily ran for freedom. That's how like much highly they thought of Paul. They were willing to stay there with him instead of making it free, which is just like insane to think about, like how much like influence he had over those people to not flee, like criminals leaving jail. Like, that's just insane to me. So I think of Paul as one.
That's a really good example.
Yeah, I kind of think of Esther as a good leader by example, when she had to like go up, and she was like the big hope of the Jewish people at the time, and to save them, and she had to go before the king, and that took a lot of guts and a lot of faith that God would come through with that. And so a lot of good leadership also has like faith that God will provide, and that he will lead you to the right place.
I mean, that's it even goes into another great topic, is all the great women leaders in scripture. So the fact that Mary was the first preacher is beyond me. Like, think about it. The very first person to preach the good news of Jesus rising from the dead was a woman, which in their day was really risky because women were not considered like credible sources or whatever. And yet Jesus put the testimony, the first person he reveals himself to after rising from the grave was Mary, and Mary Magdalene. And she was the first person to go and tell the other disciples. She was the first person to proclaim with absolute faith that Jesus has risen from the grave. I've seen him with my own eyes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's true.
Didn't know that.
Yeah. And she's the first one she was, or at least one of the first ones to make radical sacrifices of generosity for Jesus. Like when they're eating a dinner and she busts open a jar of perfume that would have cost 2 years' salary and spends it all it cracks it all open just to anoint him and worship him. Like, just for that one moment.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about how much salary that actually be today. Like, no one in today's culture, I feel like even Christian or not, would be willing to do that. Like,
yeah, exactly.
And just the way like she like when like they're like in the house with Jesus too, and like Mary like sets a good example of like servant leadership, where like she's just like talking to Jesus and stuff, and like Jesus like just kind of like how like what we're supposed to do when when Jesus is there. I don't know how I want to word this, but like she's like just like really soaking up every time she can get with him, and instead of like when like Martha is like like doing the dishes or whatever and gets like mad at her for not like helping out and stuff. I think it's a really good reminder for us today, just to like how even though we're busy with stuff, we always need to make time for Jesus, you know, like reading our Bible and stuff, no matter what we have, like how much homework, how much stuff we have to do, you know, like there's no excuse. Like we should always make time for Jesus, like and spend time with him when we can. So that's what kind of I got out of that story too.